Because of the following special presentation, great performances, America, and Bill Moyer's World of Ideas will not be seen tonight.
Campaign, a series of public television election specials.
Funding for Frontline is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding for this campaign special is provided by the Markle Foundation.
Tonight, who are the men running for president? One, an Eastern establishment man famous for his resume.
He's a general-purpose public servant. He's not a specialist who changed the world around in a special way.
The other, the son of immigrants, a three-term governor in his first national campaign.
I think he has about as much self-confidence and about as little self-doubt as anybody I know in public life.
What kind of president would each of them be? Tonight, the choice.
This is Frontline, in association with Time Magazine, a special report with Judy Woodruff.
Good evening. Just 2 weeks before Election Day, what we know and sense about Michael Dukakis and George Bush is now dominated by the campaign itself, by the images and sound bites so carefully crafted by their advisors. And in this year of intense negative campaigning, each man has at times been defined by what his opponent says about him. For a different perspective, tonight, Frontline and Time Magazine step back from the heat of the campaign to examine in depth the lives and political careers of these two candidates, and to listen carefully to the people who know them best. Our correspondent is the author, historian, and presidential scholar Gary Wills. Tonight's program was produced and reported by Sherry Jones, co-producer Elizabeth Sams, and field producer Chris Buchanan. It is called The Choice.
I accept your nomination for president.
I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
We derive our national identity in part from the kind of president we pick, labeling our times the Kennedy years, or Nixon years, Johnson years, and so on. The president has come to typify our sense of values, of opportunities, and of perils. With the vote we cast in just 15 days, we shall make a binding choice, binding ourselves to live through the Bush years or the Dukakis years. The difference between the two should be a marked one, because the candidates are in effect from different Americas. There is an America of advantage and privilege, of public service as a tradition, of having the right connections. One man grew up in this America, in Greenwich, Connecticut, a place of comfort where privilege was not arrogant but quiet, in most cases polished and charming. The son of an international financier, George Herbert Walker Bush was born in 1924. At the Greenwich Country Day School, where he was driven by the family's gardener, he was always more an object of admiration than of envy.
They called him Poppy in those days. He was a fellow that everybody wanted to emulate, whether it was younger brothers or friends or anything. He was just the person that everybody wanted to be around and wanted to get next to and wanted to play games with, and wanted to ride in the car with, whatever it was. He was a fabulous young guy. And great, funny person to be with, lots of fun all the time. It was an enjoyable childhood for all of us, I think. At the school we went to, they had a little category called claims no more than his fair share of time and attention. And George always got very high marks and claims no more than his fair share. And Mother, that always pleased Mother a great deal. She really believed in a very simple set of early American virtues, if you will. Play hard, be a good loser, work on your individual skills, and play as a part of the team.
There is also an America of immigrant challenge, of opportunities to be taken, prizes earned, and merit rewarded. Michael Dukakis' mother came to this America from Greece in 1913.
Here I was, a 9-year-old who came to this country and took to it like duck to water. I never missed my other life. Somebody said, "Weren't you homesick for Greece?" That's my home was with my father, my mother, my sisters, my brothers. I had them with me.
The bustling Greek immigrant community in Massachusetts was also home to Panos Dukakis, whose older brothers had come before him, promising to pay for his education if he followed them. In 1924, he became the first Greek immigrant to graduate from Harvard Medical School. A year later, Euterpe graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Bates College.
I was one of the early immigrant girls who went to school. Came just naturally. Whatever was the American scheme, we took to it, both my husband and I.
In 1933, Michael Stanley Dukakis was born to the hard-working couple. His brother Stelian was 3 years older.
They expected them to succeed in life. They expected them to do well in whatever they undertook. But it wasn't a problem because they knew that those A's would be on the report card when a report card came home. They didn't have to say, "Michael, now remember, you've got to get an A in this and that." They knew it was coming. Things came more difficult to Stelian. He had to work harder to achieve the results, whereas in Michael, I think things came a lot easier.
He was a little stubborn. He was at the 6th grade. For some reason, he started writing very small, tiny little letters, very meticulously. And Miss Kendrick said, "Now, Michael, that's too small. You may be able to see them, but all of us can't see it. You better try a little larger." No, Michael kept going on. "Michael, please do your writing." No, nothing doing. Well, he got a C in writing. And that was a shock to Michael. He changed.
For the 5 Bush children, family games filled the days.
We never discussed, what was happening with the Anschluss or anything like that. I mean, I don't think the family thought it was their job to burden our lives with a lot of history or a lot of, current events or that kind of thing. We never discussed those things. Issues of the day were not things we talked about at the table. Mother wanted quiet so that Dad could, have a quiet dinner and not be bothered with all that was on his mind. He was very much involved in his work, the extraordinary number of things in the public interest that he was involved in. I mean, if there was any project in the town of Greenwich that needed doing, it always got dumped on Dad. He was always the man that took it on.
Michael always wanted to be a politician. The dining room conversations centered around politics. Generally, kids want to talk about being policemen and firemen, and that wasn't in Michael's mind. He wanted to be a politician. He wanted to be governor of Massachusetts. He wanted to do things his way.
Oh, we were very much interested always. We discussed politics in time of elections. We talked about candidates and all that around the dinner table. We always listened to the news, and that was about the only program we did listen to, really, as a family. Somebody said to ask me, how is it that Michael became so interested in politics? Well, politics comes from the Greek word polis, which means city, and anything that concerns the city is politics. So Greeks are very much interested in politics. Even the simplest peasant in Greece knows all that's going on in the United States.
In 1937, George Bush went from Greenwich to the famous preparatory school, Phillips Academy at Andover. It was the first stop on what was then called the Andover-Yale Railroad.
Andover and Exeter and the rest of them were all based upon Eton and Harrow. And they were, kids in England, of course, were brought up that way. Yes, sir. This older teacher said, when you come here, there are 4 things. You eat, you sleep, you study, and you don't break rules. Anything else is irrelevant.
George was ready for this thing. I mean, he was ready. His family prepared him for this sort of stuff. And, but he was agreeable. He was adequate. We were glad he was here.
He got a pretty low grade with me. I'm not supposed to tell what it was, so I'm not going to say. But it was not very good. I remember very little about him in class, except that he didn't say anything. He did what he was told.
He was a natural on the athletic field. He always enjoyed himself. He enjoyed himself. Athletics were fun for him.
On the campus, he was a classic BMOC. Smiling, polite, big man in the school and the fraternities. Never rocked any boats. He fitted in perfectly. This was a pretty isolated school as far as the country was concerned. I always felt that one of the faults in our education was that we knew nothing about politics, race, social disturbances. The kids were kept in an isolated world so that the Depression really didn't touch the school as far as the boys were concerned.
Michael Dukakis grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, a competitive and earnest place sandwiched between Boston and Cambridge. In the late 1940s, its high school was rated one of the best in the country.
Most of us were first-generation children, first-generation Americans. Our parents were immigrants. Their hopes and ambitions for their children, for us, were that we would move that much further ahead. So you went about school in a very diligent way. You would never fail a course. I mean, you couldn't do that, that's all. Michael was known as a very, very smart guy, and because of the whole ethos of the school, very much respected.
Everybody knew of Michael. He was voted chief brain in the face, which means that he was the most brilliant, which he was.
It was the kind of school where having brains was considered sexy, though that seemed to embarrass Dukakis at the time.
I wanted to meet him because it was so mysterious that he was this really cute young man who didn't go out with girls. The parties and the dances and the socials, I don't think Michael really participated that much. He was somewhat socially shy.
He was president of the Honor Society, good at sports, and home every night by 5:30.
He fit in well, and he didn't. He was at once well-liked and popular, but at the same time, somewhat removed. Michael did listen to an inner drummer. I mean, he liked to play in the band, and it didn't trouble him at all that it was this nerdy thing to do, you know. I mean, he went out and marched around and tooted his horn and had a terrific time. It says something about Brookline and the high school especially that we felt onward and upward. I mean, that we were destined for great things.
Michael had always shared that destiny with his older brother Stelian.
Michael talks about Stelian being the leader, and he kind of followed him around. He was the one that organized games and teams and athletic activity in and around their home and on the school playground. And Michael followed in his shadow when they were children.
But the need to excel put extra strain on Stelian, the softer one. He attempted suicide in Michael's senior year in high school.
I think he knew that Stelian didn't want to live. That was what was so incomprehensible to him. And what shattered me was that, you know, Michael's eyes filled up with tears, and I had never seen a boy be so sad. And this was a boy that I really adored. So it was very traumatic.
After that, Stelian lived a disordered life until 1973, when he was killed while cycling by a hit-and-run driver.
Michael is so cerebral. And if I could have said to him, well, you know, such and such happens, and this is what happens. It's like an equation. But things aren't that way. And there are some things in life that you just don't understand. I mean, we just don't understand.
(1942). On the day George Bush turned 18, he volunteered for the Navy. He flew 58 missions and survived 4 crashes. When he came home to enter Yale in 1945, he was an authentic war hero on a campus full of them.
It was really kind of a big veterans organization that you were joining when you went on the campus. Everybody was in a hurry to get back into civilian life and to get their education behind them. A lot of fun, you know, a lot of released pressures. A lot of us hadn't seen girls for a long time, for example. What made him different was he was very young, and he was very married. He was a very good athlete. What people really knew about him is that he was a lot of fun to be with.
At Yale, Bush was captain of the baseball team, a member, along with his friend Lud Ashley, of the exclusive secret society Skull and Bones, a Phi Beta Kappa economics student. And, like many on the campus crowded with veterans, he completed his college education in 2.5 years.
You didn't focus too far into the future, in all truth. And I think that's because people have come from living day to day and were happy to be able to do so. So the idea of scoping into the future and saying, I'm thinking of running for public office, I mean, people who did that were laughed at. They were just, I mean, you took it very slowly and in that regard, and your vision of the future, frankly, was a somewhat limited one.
In 1951, Michael Dukakis entered Swarthmore College near Philadelphia. While it was as natural for a Brookline High graduate to aspire to Harvard as for Andover students to enter Yale, Dukakis wanted a smaller and less social school. He objected to fraternities as exclusive and was drawn to Swarthmore's Quaker tradition.
We were taken enormously seriously in the best sense of the word. It was that you were going to do something very important. And I remember the sense of when Mike would talk politics or when the rest of us would talk other ideas, you were going to go out and do something the best you could for the world, and you meant it. People really cared.
You talk to people who were in his class, and they're pretty unanimous in saying that he arrived there fully formed. One person said that she knew she was late by the time Dukakis arrived at breakfast, and the same way went by the time he went to the library. She could set her clock by him. The bottom line was Michael was not going to be deterred from his task of finishing his paper or his assignment on time, that he knew what was important to him and what wasn't, and that he may have missed out on a certain frivolity that way, but he got his paper in on time.
Although Dukakis deferred for a while to his father's wish that he become a doctor, public service absorbed him. And at Swarthmore, where he was one of 5 to graduate Phi Beta Kappa with highest honors, government was considered an honorable calling.
Michael had this pragmatic orientation, which was much stronger than me, and and an almost intuitive sense of strategy. If government starts at the local level, then you start at the local level and build on it. Whereas my head was off in Guatemala or in relations between the races or some other sort of transcendental issues. He was willing to take life a small increment at a time. And he didn't try to make giant leaps, and therefore he didn't fall on his face, really.
We grew up in a generation where emotion in politics and passion in politics was the last thing you wanted. Politics was, in fact, a rational alternative to passionate conflict. That's what politics was supposed to be about. And when we talked about passion in politics, we thought about people like Huey Long, Father Coughlin, the sort of, boogeyman of my childhood, and in extremis Adolf Hitler.
Senator, I think I never
For Dukakis and his friends, the McCarthy hearings were a watershed event.
I was glued to the then black and white television set. I had a little one in my room, and while I was trying to write seminar papers, I was watching the Army McCarthy hearings.
At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know this hurts you, Mr. Welch.
It was awesome. That sinister influence was nibbling, eating away big chunks at the U.S. government and people who were politically out of favor with Senator McCarthy and others in the government.
As a college intern in 1954, Dukakis was in Washington when McCarthy was censured by the Senate. It was the one great national issue that engaged him.
People went one of two ways, and the way he went was to reject the McCarthy years, and I guess it was the closest thing to the Vietnam War, which was a litmus test issue for the next generation as to how people saw themselves.
While Dukakis spent the 50s as a politicized student and a GI in post-war Korea, George Bush entered the world of business. Like many sons of old money, he felt a need to test himself in a rougher world. For him, that meant oil prospecting in West Texas, on ranch land that rested on the Permian oil pool.
A bunch of us came, as George did, trying to make it in the oil business right after World War II. Yeah, we talked about, having much broader view of what there was to life than doing what your father or your uncle had done.
In fact, hundreds of them had come from the East. They were known to the locals as the Ivy Leaguers.
Midland was a western town. It was primarily a cattle town, and the oil people would adapt to the western habit to the extent that they would be wearing big hats and boots and whatnot. And some of us frowned on that. There are still one or two characters out there who make disparaging comments about them. But to my way of thinking, we're the cream of the crop, of the Ivy League crop, because they were adventurers.
A lot of them thought that they could come out to West Texas and make their fortune and be back in time for the Harvard-Yale game.
They spent their time seeking rights to the oil pool, buying them from landowners, selling them to companies with money to drill. Bush described it as the great adventure of his life, but there was always a safety net.
He approached me with the idea that if he could put together some money for us to speculate in these oil properties with, would that be interesting to me? And I said, nothing could be possibly more interesting to me because I had zero money in. His uncle, Herbie Walker, helped him raise the money. And that put us in business instantly, practically overnight.
George was a leader in wanting to introduce new things to the community in Midland. You could see that. And there were a matter of building hospitals, schools, and churches, doing all the things that you do in a growing community.
It was a promising time until the morning their 3-year-old daughter, waking up in this house, said she thought she'd stay in bed.
When I examined Robin, the complaints were not very serious. She had a little fever and a little sore throat, been a little cross. But when I examined her, it was pretty obvious that she had leukemia. At that time, There had been no children who had recovered from leukemia. It was 100% mortality.
I mean, I couldn't tell you how much family and friends meant to us, but the faith we had was extraordinary. And then it was strengthened, I think, by our love for each other.
I think it caused a certain softening and understanding, you know. It was a very maturing experience. Of course, Barbara and George were just shaken to the bone.
Well, I know Barbara's hair turned white. They, both of them, accepted the fact. They immediately verified it with the highest of authorities in that disease and took the very best course for treatment of it and went on with their lives. They had a lot of other children that they had to think of as well as Robin.
In 1953, Bush and John Overby had merged with two other partners to form Zapata Petroleum, an oil company that would eventually become Pennzoil. As soon as he had acquired the minimum fortune for a Texas businessman, Bush left the partnership. By that time, he had moved to Houston. He had decided to run for office, a big office like the one his father had won in Connecticut 12 years earlier. At age 40, Bush wanted to be a United States Senator.
This delightful beverage is poured at dozens of small rallies called coffees all over Texas, where dozens of charming young Republican women pour and sip and listen to George Bush explain why he's the man for the U.S. Senate.
It was his first race. We were new at it and doing the best we could. And really, we thought we had a shot at it. About halfway through the campaign, we decided it was time to have what I call a little bus tour through Central Texas. He'd come into a town and there'd be a crowd there that he'd talk to, and then he'd get back on the bus and go 15 miles, 20 miles to the next town and say the same thing almost. And it was exhausting. About 6 o'clock in the morning, well, somebody'd be beating on the door, getting you up, and handing you a cup of coffee, but it wouldn't be campaign chairman. It wouldn't be an advance guy. It was George Bush handing out that cup of coffee.
Anyone who joins us in all sincerity, we will...
When Bush ran in 1964, Barry Goldwater was at the top of the national ticket, and the right-wing John Birch Society was a force in Texas politics.
Those who do not care for our cause, we don't expect to enter our ranks in any case. I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Way right, they gave him trouble. They were fairly vocal. They truly will spend the hours necessary to advance their positions.
To overcome any doubts about his being an Eastern establishment man, a moderate like his father, Bush ran as a Goldwater loyalist, opposing the nuclear test ban treaty, China's admission to the United Nations, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He lost anyway, buried in Lyndon Johnson's landslide.
Well, you know, the extraordinary thing about our system is that if you pick yourself up, dust yourself off, you can start all over again. And that's really what it's all about. You're only out when you say you're out. And George is not a man to ever say he's out.
2 years later, he lowered his sights and won a seat in the House of Representatives. He had run as a moderate from his wealthy Houston district. That he was troubled by positions he took in 1964 was revealed to a friend and political opponent who visited him.
I had an afternoon off and went by his office to say hello. And I don't even remember how it came up, but he just said, you know, John, in that election, I took some of the far-right positions that I thought I needed to get elected, and I regret it, and I hope I'll never do it again.
In 1968, when civil rights consumed the country, Bush faced a crucial vote on an open housing bill. He voted for a procedural motion that could have defeated the legislation. When that failed, and it was clear the bill was going to pass anyway, Bush and 7 other Texans switched their votes to yes, angering conservatives back home.
I suspect that his position on civil rights wasn't that the goal was wrong at all, but that the way to do it is through letting the wise, established people do it in decent order, which means it never gets done, which is my problem with it. I think that's the best you can expect from somebody who comes from his background. He represents about the best of noblesse oblige.
Early on, Richard Nixon had spotted Bush as a man from the party's liberal Rockefeller wing who would serve the conservative Goldwater wing. In 1970, he urged Bush to run for the Senate once again.
1, 2, 3. We love you, Mr. President!
And now, my friends, since this is a state that thinks of itself and is very proud of its #1 teams and its #1 band, I'll tell you that I'm very proud to be standing here with what I think is a team of champions.
Though his father opposed the bid as too risky, Bush was assured by his patron, the president, that if he lost, there would be a federal appointment.
And I must say that the opinions of
Bush had not expected Democratic Congressman Lloyd Benson, another wealthy businessman, to be his opponent. Benson ran as the true Texas conservative, even though Bush supported Nixon's Vietnam policy and opposed busing and campus protests.
We were sitting in a suite in the Shamrock Hotel, and I remember he sat over on a couch to one side and just, it's kind of one of those situations where you hate to approach the candidate because you just don't have any good news. And he slumped a little further and further into that couch as the night wore on. And finally, I remember somebody went over to him and said, how do you feel? And he said, well, I don't know about you, but to me it feels like about 12 minutes past 84. And I thought, what does that mean? And I asked him, I said, what does that mean? He said, I don't know, but that's how I feel right now.
And nobody likes to lose, but certainly he ran a good, tough race.
On November 3rd, 1970, the voters in what George Bush called his adopted state rejected him for a second time.
Too. I feel kind of like Custer, you know, there were too many Indians. Well, there are too many Democrats in some of these counties, I guess. But the other thing is that I have a horrible problem between now and kind of figuring this out because I can't think of anybody else to blame. Thank you very much.
During the years George Bush was struggling to build a Republican Party in Texas, the Democratic Party in Massachusetts was having problems of its own. Daily headlines trumpeted the doings of Boston's colorful but corrupt party hacks.
Boston was a dreadful place and a misgoverned place and a place that was full of crookedness and patronage and waste. The Democratic Party was really not an admirable piece of machinery. It was very much a family affair, and it was very much in the tradition that the governors had more at stake in the government than the governed than the people did. And that was very, very offensive to all of us.
After 2 years in Korea, Michael Dukakis came home to Harvard Law School and began to seek others who were angry at the state's political corruption.
Michael probably had the idea that we could have an impact on the Democratic Party if we were to elect local committees. Michael usually was ahead of us in having thought of what would be useful to do, and then he would call people in with instructions. He was always, in that sense, the leader.
The reformers campaigned door to door in their mostly well-to-do neighborhoods. Determined but quiet, they took the party's old guard by surprise.
At the first meeting, the former chairman, whose name, if you can believe it, was Charlie McGlue, right out of the last hurrah, came into this room and he said, "This is an invalid meeting." And we said, "Sit down."
After taking over at the ward level, the reformers coordinated their campaigns for the state legislature. Dukakis was one of 10 young Turks elected in 1962.
He had this steady approach and a conviction that if he just did this kind of thing day after day, evening after evening, car stop after car stop, doorbell after doorbell, that it would add up. And it did.
We're not really interested in increasing our numbers. What we are interested in is helping to guide and direct policy towards certain goals which we think are terribly important for the Democratic Party and which we believe have not been paramount during the past year or two or three of this legislature.
The goal was to improve the quality of Massachusetts state government. It was not ideological. We felt, I think, and felt that if government worked, life would be better. It was somewhat naive, but I think that Michael is genuinely an optimist.
In Boston, the 60s were torn with passion, from the civil rights struggle to protests at the war in Vietnam. Dukakis was not one of those who marched or demonstrated. Though he voted correctly for a liberal, the young legislator moved through the 60s intent on reforms like no-fault car insurance, legislation he championed for 4 years.
What the Senate did last night on the subject of auto insurance is a slap in the face at every motorist in Massachusetts. The so-called merit rating plan it passed is, in my opinion, a sham and a fraud. It is totally unworkable.
One of his strengths is that he is very good at seeing what's right in front of him and dealing with it, attacking it, going after it. He doesn't avoid the big problems that are sitting right in front of him. And for the Democratic Party, for a suburbanite, for a liberal, in the late 50s and early 60s, what was sitting right in front of them was a party that was quite conservative, that had had a lot of problems with corruption, and that was oriented in the cities. That was what was right in front of him. That was the problem that he went out to solve. I mean, this is not a person who came into politics out of a spirit of helping people. This is a person who came into politics out of a spirit of cleaning up government.
After 4 terms in the legislature, Dukakis agreed with his fellow reformers to run for Attorney General. But when that race looked too difficult, Dukakis made his own decision to go for the office a friend was seeking.
He came to my house one night, 9 or 9:30 in the evening. He hadn't done that before. He'd been to the house, hadn't come at night, came by himself. I admitted him to the house. We went into my den. Not much small talk. And very short order, he told me why he had come, that he'd come to tell me that he was going to run for lieutenant governor, the position that I was running for, notwithstanding the fact that we had known each other and had been friends for 20 years. He didn't give me a choice.
He was in the legislature, but not of the legislature. He didn't give people a sense that he loved politics or loved the process. He thought it was inefficient. He thought that people who disagreed with him needed to have his point of view explained to them again. He was enormously respected, but he was not beloved, and he was not thought of as a part of the group, part of the club.
Running for this high office, convinced that as the governor's chief deputy is one who can follow through for him in these great areas of public policy, that I can make an even greater contribution to better government and a better life for the people of Massachusetts.
Dukakis lost when the Democratic ticket was defeated. On the same night in 1970, George Bush lost in Texas. True to Nixon's word, the White House searched for a consolation prize to offer Bush after his Senate defeat. One appointment Nixon and his men did not consider at first was ambassador to the United Nations. But there was a vacancy there, and according to John Ehrlichman's notes of White House meetings, Bush asked for the UN position. Nixon resisted. He wanted Bush in a political job. Finally, Bush pleaded his case in person. The president, he said, needed an advocate in New York, and the social circles Bush would move in as ambassador could be very useful. That meeting was a turning point in his career.
President. Mr. President and Mr. Vice President, distinguished members of the cabinet, including my new boss, Secretary Rogers.
I wonder where he had gotten such a quick education in foreign affairs. And I asked him where he had. And he chuckled and said that he would know a lot more about foreign affairs in 2 months than he might at that time, and for me not to worry.
I was director of intelligence in the State Department, and it was my job to brief ambassadors, and he came around to see me. Well, often those interviews are kind of perfunctory, you know, and I expected this one to be because he was a prominent politician already. But it didn't work out that way. He was interested in what I could tell him about how to do his job well. He said, essentially, I'm here to learn.
Well, he got to know every single name of every single ambassador, some of them very hard to pronounce, and he would pronounce them invariably wrong, but with great enthusiasm. He had great affection for people, and he was just, you know, really loved at the United Nations.
While he was ambassador, President Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger were arranging their secret accord with the People's Republic of China. But Bush followed instructions to keep the Taiwan delegation seated, even though the White House privately called this a lost cause. Bush did not know his president was making his performance a charade.
Fellow delegates, the issue is clearly marked now. Inclusion or expulsion, impartiality or one-sided and arbitrary punishment. If this is not an important question, what is? Let the United Nations take the affirmative.
Bush was out of the loop on that, too. It was a little embarrassing at the time, but and I don't think that he wasn't trusted. But if he had disappointments, particularly involving the administration, you know, he's intensely loyal, and he doesn't share those situations with others, even good friends.
In 1972, Nixon took his landslide re-election victory as a mandate to clear out everyone in his administration who was not a total loyalist. Eliminate the politicians, he told Haldeman and Ehrlichman. Except for George Bush, he'd do anything for the cause. Nixon asked Bush to name any disloyal staff at the UN. Not brains, loyalty, Nixon said, and Bush complied. He hoped to be promoted for his uncomplaining service, but Nixon offered him a lowly job, chairman of the National Republican Committee, with promises of better things to come. In the end, Bush said, "I'll do what you tell me." He submitted, grudging but loyal.
The President has asked me, along with Chairman Dole, to take on new responsibility in the political arena. This I'll do, and I think it's important to do, particularly what the President of the United States wants you to do when you're appointed. But I have very mixed emotions. One, the challenge of the future looks fantastic, but the excitement of the President and the importance of the President would have to make me answer by saying not glad.
I told him that I thought he was, that he had it all backwards, that he should go from a Republican National Committee kind of post to the UN, but to go from the UN to this then unseemly kind of political post, at the time when Nixon was in the worst kind of political difficulty, struck me as being a no-brainer. It just didn't make any sense to me at all.
2 weeks before Bush began his new job, the trial of the Watergate burglars had begun.
But I'll be darned, as we express our concern about the alleged infidelity of a few, that we should permit the ugliness to obscure the positive record of the President of the United States, in whom I, as head of this party, have absolutely total confidence as to his integrity. I believe what he says. People said to me the other day, do you think the President knew about Watergate? I said, he didn't know about Watergate. And they said, how do you know? I said, because I believe the President and I believe in the presidency. And this I am...
He is clearly a believer in the old saying, you dance with the one that brung you. I mean, he had a job as chairman of the Republican National Committee. The president had appointed him to that job, so obviously the loyalty went there.
Counsel will call the first witness.
And he felt very, very strongly that the Republican Party could not and should not be tainted with Watergate.
The central question at this point is simply put, what did the president know, and when did he know it?
He would say, if the president wants me to do that, I know the president will call me and tell me that's what he wants done. But until such time, I'll wait for him to tell me that that's what he wants done on this.
This is a rather remarkable letter about the tapes. If you notice, the president says he's heard the tapes, or some of them, and they sustain his position. But he says he's not going to let anybody else hear them, for fear they might draw a different conclusion.
It was almost on a one-day basis that he suddenly realized that he had not been told the truth, and that the party and the country had not been told the truth, and that this was the worst thing in the world that a president could do. It was a shameful, shameful thing.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
I don't know that I quite understand what they mean by being used. What I think it could as easily be characterized as is if he agrees to do something, he follows through and tries to do it. Because again, with George Bush, in addition to the people thing, is the ethics. And I mean, he has a tremendous personal sense of ethics. And with George Bush, you never have to have a written contract on anything. I mean, you just never would have to have. And so if he's given his word to do something, even though others may be perceiving it as being used, and even though it may end up being used, if he'd given his word, he'd still do it.
Others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
On the day before Nixon resigned, George Bush finally urged him to do so.
Well, good luck. Good.
Give him my best.
Hi.
How are you? Nice to see you.
1974 was also an election year in Massachusetts. Boston was embroiled in controversy over integrating its schools. The city was bitterly divided. Michael Dukakis, the practical reformer, was the Democrats' nominee for governor. Trying to stay above the fray, he concocted a plan to integrate only after-school activities and took his idea to some of the city's black leadership.
We had a dual school system, as dual as any school system in the Deep South prior to 1954. He had to understand that. What got me disturbed was that he appeared to be willing to come up with some kind of silly consensus that was somehow going to hold his liberal to progressive constituency and hopefully get him the constituency that existed in South Boston, Dorchester, Hyde Park, and the white ethnic wards of the city. The more he talked about it, the more upset I got, because it was clear that he did not have a bottom line.
The state's economy and its financial condition will clearly be the major issues in the campaign. We have the worst economic and job development record in the country, and we're about the only state that can't balance its own budget. And In the meantime, other states like Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey are not only doing much better on the economic development side, but are enjoying very handsome budgetary surpluses. And those two issues clearly are the most important issues facing the state.
As Democrats across the country were winning in the aftermath of Watergate, Dukakis defeated the liberal Republican incumbent Frank Sargent and became governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
My parents often told me when I was a boy that much had been given to me and much was expected of me. Those words apply with even more relevance.
With a campaign slogan that said Mike Dukakis should be governor, he had achieved his long-term ambition. And the driven rectitude that had brought him this far must, he believed, be maintained.
We really share so many of the same values, so there's a great deal of sameness in terms of our attitudes and philosophy. We are very different in terms of personality. I describe Michael as somebody who can take a peanut out of a can, and I can't stop eating with just one peanut. He's a very disciplined person.
When you mow the lawn, it looks better. And when you grow tomatoes, you get something out of it. He's a very purposeful person. He has a plan. He has a reason for doing things. It's not frivolous. And to him, I think there's probably a distinction between growing flowers and growing tomatoes along that dimension. I don't think it's an accident that he grows tomatoes. It seems to have more purpose. He's not the kind of person who you can imagine doing things that don't seem to be part of a plan.
As he took office in 1975, Dukakis wanted to run the state as a kind of civics textbook in action.
It was a very, very strenuous, unpleasant period where what you described as his single-minded quality was too much in evidence, and where his somewhat limited view of how state government could operate was predominant. And the notion that he could have a useful cabinet meeting that was open to the public was perhaps the pits of that particular experience. I would describe it as reform run amok.
Meetings would be open. Favoritism would be abolished. No cronyism, no deals, not even friendship.
During the '74 campaign with Frank Sargent, where Sargent and Dukakis had a debate, somebody asked them, would they favor appointing people who would help them in the campaign? And Dukakis answered first, and he said the fact that someone has helped him in his campaign would have no weight whatsoever on whether or not they worked in his administration. And Sargent guffawed. I mean, he thought that was I think he thought it was disingenuous, but he learned later it was not disingenuous, which was probably of more concern than if it had at least been disingenuous. That would be more understandable.
He had been campaigning against the notion of cronyism for 8-10 years before he became governor, and we were cronies too. What I think was annoying to us is that we thought we were good guys. Even if we were friends, we were good guys and competent guys, and he could have made some use of us.
Surrounded by a young and inexperienced staff, the young and inexperienced governor was immediately confronted with a problem he had not anticipated: a huge deficit left by the Sargent administration.
After he got into office, his transition team and the Sargent transition team finally agreed in December that the size of the problem was in excess of $500 million. That was heavy money in those days. And he still said, no, I'm going to make the cuts and I'll get it without the taxes. Michael Dukakis was very, very sure of himself. And he also was convinced that it can't be as bad as the naysayers say, but it was.
He had promised not to raise taxes.
Well, no matter how you cut it, given the tax structure we have in the state, any tax that's imposed is going to hit the wrong people in many cases.
His word was at stake, not a mere politician's promise. So, despite the unexpected deficit, he opposed every legislative effort to raise taxes. cutting government spending was the only resource he left himself.
I'm very troubled about some aspects of this budget. I'm particularly concerned about the effect on health care and medical care in the state for our working poor.
Vowing to take what he called a meat cleaver to the budget, he cut salaries for state employees, stripped programs for the most vulnerable people in society, and made these decisions in isolation.
If you really did care about people, you wouldn't be cutting welfare and unemployment. You'd be cutting the banks, you'd stop giving them interest money, you'd stop paying their debt.
You know, you sail a ship with a captain, and he knows what the crew's doing, and he brings the crew in and he tells them what to do. This captain just sails the ship and lets the crew run the rest of the ship any way they want. And I think that that's a very, very great failing of this governor. For whatever reason it is, I don't know what it is in him that he won't sit down and try to hammer these things out with legislators.
Talking to the governor is like talking to Mount Rushmore. He's got a favorite saying. It says, "I hear you." You'll be talking to him and he says, "I hear you." Well, that's become like, "I'm behind you 1,000%.
And I know a lot of times.
Wait a second.
Can anybody live on $12.7 a year?
Well,
We qualify for low housing, food stamps, and reduced hot lunches.
Well, as I pointed out, I think a little earlier, most of our state troopers are making, in fact, substantially more than $12,000.
Yes, but that's working 7 days a week.
No, that includes an
double shifts and not staying there, family.
No.
At least you have Sundays off. We don't.
No, let me say that also includes an educational career bonus that averages about $1,600 per trooper, and 70% of them are not
Because
getting
he
it.
is so bright, and because he is so concentrated, that I think the casual observations that other people might have are not interesting. Not as interesting as his own thoughts. And you develop a habit, I suppose, in the intense preoccupation that positions like governor or president entail, where you don't have time to listen to everybody's comments.
He had not gone about a very simple process of bringing in those human services advocates before he made the decision to say, times are tough. This is where the situation is. I have to cut somewhere. I'm going to have to do two things. I'm going to have to raise new revenues. I'm going to have to give up my own public promise, which is very difficult for me to do. If he'd walked through that process, I think people would have been helpful.
Having achieved this aspiration, this lifelong, virtually, aspiration, he thought that was the hard part, that the hard work was done. He had thought for so long, if I could only be governor, everything would be okay, that he thought that was the end of the story instead of the beginning of the story.
President Ford had passed over George Bush for the job he wanted, vice president, and named him envoy to China instead. A year later, in 1975, Ford called Bush home for yet another assignment.
It is my intention to nominate Ambassador Bush to be director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA is one of our nation's most important institutions. During this difficult period, Bill Colby, as director of the CIA, has done an outstanding job of working with the Congress to look
The CIA was in trouble. The Watergate hearings had uncovered illegalities that led a Senate committee to investigate secret CIA plans to assassinate foreign leaders.
Does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman.
Isn't it true, too, that...
Director Colby had cooperated with the investigation. But with each new revelation, the reputation of the agency suffered a new blow.
Strike a human target.
The political damage had to be contained, morale restored.
Welcome, George. Welcome to the CIA.
I want this job.
And Bush was by now the nicest man for putting a good face on nasty situations. He had done it during the Taiwan reversal and the Watergate scandal.
And I'm proud to be a part of the CIA. Thank you very much.
Do you think you made any progress in there talking to the senators? Are they?
I don't know. There were a lot of hard feelings between the agency and the committee for some of the things that were being said. What was Bush's approach to that? Well, let's have a dinner. Bring Church over here and get these guys in here that they're all upset about that, and we'll talk about it. And we did, which is one way of his approaching it. Let's get it out on the table, you know. We'll talk about it.
Bush, a good team player, won the respect of the agency and conciliated Congress.
CIA not as a maker of foreign policy, but is one who should forcefully and objectively present to the President and the National Security Council the findings and the views of the intelligence community.
He promised no partisanship in the sensitive job. But within months of his appointment, in one of the few important decisions on his watch, Bush responded to President Ford and to pressure from the right wing. Those on the right had long criticized the CIA's crucial assessment of Soviet military strength for being too soft. To placate them, Bush agreed to appoint a group of outsiders to second-guess the agency.
We were divided into two teams. Team A was the CIA team, and we were Team B. And we were assured of access to all the same evidence.
And how were the members of Team B selected?
Well, once I was chosen as chairman, I was given a free hand in choosing the members.
They were all super hawks. They were all people who believed that the United States should be spending much more money for defense and should be preparing for war.
The Team A, after all, is the company team. It's the one that always is trying to adjust competitive viewpoints and make them come out in a sensible way. If you were going to do this exercise, I would have suggested having a Team C, which was a bunch of peaceniks who felt that the Russians weren't spending much money at all.
But the Team A was a team of peaceniks.
Bush gave Team B the classified documents it needed to challenge the single most important intelligence product of the CIA's own analysts.
What they were saying throughout was, and that was of course evident in their writings, if we were on the Soviet side, what would we think and what would we do? We, Americans. But they're not Americans. They're Russians. And they have a very different outlook on life. They had just gone through a horrible war, not very long before that. They look at things very differently. To them, human lives are not what they are to us. You know, they could sacrifice nearly 1 million lives to defend one city. In World War II, we haven't lost 1 million lives in all our wars combined since the War of Independence. They have very different values.
I called it, if I remember correctly, a kangaroo court. We knew how this exercise was going to come out.
As the work of Team B proceeded, what was Director Bush's involvement, curiosity, questions? I mean, was he?
Well, he was very much in the background. I mean, we didn't deal with him. Well, I think it's very much his style. He's not a man who reveals his opinions very much. He wants to stay in the background, and he does what needs to be done.
After Ford lost to Jimmy Carter, the predictably ominous findings of Team B might have disappeared, were it not for a leak to the press and an unprecedented interview with Director Bush.
Here were all these assertions, and Bush made it very clear that he considered Team B, this study, to be the official U.S. estimate. No longer was this sort of an experiment. This had become the official estimate of U.S. intelligence.
The intelligence community is intended to base their findings on evidence, not on philosophy or conviction.
But it was a healthy exercise. It didn't hurt anybody. And I give him credit for it. I think I was generally opposed to it, but he, you know, it's his way of getting the problem on the table rather than letting people out there keep chipping away and criticizing you doing nothing about it.
Though Bush downplayed it, his decision was of critical importance. The Team B report became accepted doctrine, the basis for the vast military expenditures of the Carter and Reagan years.
This, then, is one person's vision of the future for our state and for its people. It is a vision which is brighter now because of the work we have done together over the past 3 years.
After the legislature forced a tax increase on Governor Dukakis, his administration of the state was orderly and honest. But he did not realize the depth of the grievances formed in the first year of his term.
Thank you all very, very much.
After 3 years of systematically starving the cities and towns, the governor is at last throwing them a bone. Look what's happened over the last 3 years. The state systematically has been breaking promises, and if this is a new kind of a relationship, I don't think we want any more of it.
The governor clearly intends, I think, to take credit for a lot of things which he in fact fought against for 3 years. But given that it's an election year, he's going to assume that the public does not pay very close attention, and he's probably right.
In 1978, an ex-football player and businessman named Ed King decided to challenge Dukakis for the Democratic nomination.
I really genuinely am excited, and we realize that really it's coming to us here. And as all football games, there is a kickoff and there's a final whistle. There is a kickoff here, and there'll be a final whistle sometime 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock tonight, maybe somewhat later. But we are genuinely excited. I haven't been this excited for a long time, and I'm looking forward to it.
I really don't go through the butterflies as such on this kind of a day because I have a very good feeling about the fact that we have done everything that I think a governor who is proud of his record and feels very strongly about it, but also is looking forward to the future, can do to ensure his renomination.
Okay. When we started this campaign, we adopted as a theme the theory that there was a clear choice.
On Election Day, liberals either stayed home or voted for a third candidate in the race. They wanted to teach Dukakis a lesson, and they did.
The four of us have made that clear choice.
It was particularly painful because in many ways King embodied all the worst in politics that Michael had been a reformist about. And to see that one's ideals and values and objectives were subverted by that loss to a person that he had very little respect for politically and maybe even personally, made it even more painfully distressing.
Political scientists and commentators are going to be spending a lot of time, I guess, trying to figure out what happened today in Massachusetts. A majority of the voters in this Democratic primary wanted something else.
Everybody assumed he was a shoo-in.
They have a right to have that.
I really had to be the up person in the family during that time, and it was a new role for me. And an important role because Michael was feeling so badly.
He is generally, I take it, optimistic.
He's a very up person, a very steady person. He doesn't have ups and downs.
But that time,
he did
have a continuing...
Yes. And I think it made him understand other people, the children and myself, better for reacting. I don't think Michael had ever quite understood the word depression or feeling unhappy in that way.
Even though having watched his brother go through that long...
It's a different situation when it's a loved one who dies than having gone through what he did in '78.
Coming out this side. Governor, would you be willing to come back?
In 1979, George Bush had spent 3 years out of office, traveling the country, seeking support from the party leaders he defended so strongly during the dark days of Watergate. Relying on them and on his appointive resume, he had decided to take a major step.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am a candidate for President of the United States.
I asked him at one point, I said, well, what are the 2 or 3 things that you want to accomplish if you're president? This is back in 1979. And he said, well, I'll bring the best people into the government. And my reaction to that was, that's fine, but what are you going to tell them to do? His tradition is one of service, and it's what drives him. He's not driven by greed, or he's not driven by a desire for power. He is honestly driven, comes out of a tradition where people are driven by a desire to serve. It's almost the service that's the reward, and I think that's what people who've known him see. And he honestly believes that he's prepared, that he spent a lifetime doing this, and that he can do a great job as president and ought to have the chance to do that. The problem with it goes to this whole thing is that is amorphous, because when you say to people, I want to be president because I'm ready to be president, they say, well, so is everybody else that wants to be president. What are you going to do?
Is people ask me why you want to be president of the United States, and they say it like, why would anybody in his right mind want to be president of the United States? And it's not as easy a question to answer as you think it would be. But I do believe in our fundamental institutions of family, our own religious diversity. I know what strength I get from faith, and I expect everybody here feels the same way, to varying degrees about that. What the concept of neighborhood, I think of Boston and go back historically, and you think of the ethnicity of the place and of the Commonwealth in a way. It's a strength that comes to us in this Commonwealth, with the Greeks and Italians and Irish and whatever else they are, and it's a good thing. That's a strong thing. Concept of neighborhood is important. And Barbara and I went. That's my wife, to whom I have been married for 35 years and with whom we've had 5 children. And we went and lived in China, and we had a fascinating experience, and I got to know the Chinese.
In contrast with Governor Reagan, who had a very clear sense of what he wanted to accomplish, Mr. Bush was looking for the issues that he ought to focus on. I have the impression that is still the case.
And why do you think that is?
Well, I think that it's because he may not have a very clear sense of what he wants to accomplish as president. I think that sense has clarified and has strengthened over the course of the Reagan years, and that he is now much more clearly committed to the Reagan agenda than, of course, when he was running against him in 1980.
And you see, I'm an optimist about the country. The glass, no matter how difficult the problems, is half full, not half empty. We're going into a new decade, and it's a time to take stock. It's a time to change things. It's a time to reassert our confidence in the United States. I, for one, am sick and tired of always hearing our leaders say, we've got to apologize for what we did wrong. I want to emphasize what we have always done right and lead this country to new heights of prosperity. Thank you very, very much.
Bush won the 1980 Iowa caucuses in a crowded field that included Ronald Reagan. That seemed to give him momentum, what he called Big Mo, coming into New Hampshire. There, Reagan had arranged a 2-man debate to take on the new front-runner, Bush. But when Reagan decided to include the other Republican candidates after all, Bush sat passively by while the chairman insisted on the original rules.
Excuse me, Governor Reagan. Would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for the moment? Would you turn that microphone off, please?
I am paying for this microphone.
I just want to set the record straight. I have been invited here as a guest of the Nashua newspaper. I will play by their rules. They free to make any rules they want on it. I am their guest, and I'm very glad to be here. Thank you very, very much.
Bunker Hill, Chateau Thierry, Thermopylae, the Marne.
The next morning, the national press gave Bush its verdict on his performance.
But none of history's battles can match in their renown the carnage George Bush suffered in a small New Hampshire town. Nashua's the battle where they bagged Big Mo, slowed him so, hear him croak.
It had become clear that Big Mo was not a program for the presidency. Ronald Reagan at least had a plan. And after Reagan had captured the Republican nomination, his defeated rival was not his first choice for vice president.
People in our party felt, as I'm sure many others have felt, that a proper ticket would have included the former President of the United States, Gerald Ford, as second place on the ticket. I have asked, and I am recommending to this convention, that George Bush be nominated.
Bush had ridiculed Reagan's tax plan as voodoo economics. But by the morning after his nomination, all differences were forsworn.
Let me enthusiastically support the proposal that Governor Reagan made in terms of taxes, and that was
explaining to me his views on the vice presidency. And he said he thought long and hard about it, and that he understood completely that it was a job that had no responsibility, no accountability, no decision-making aspect to it, and that he had accepted that after much thought, and said that he had personally come to the conclusion that he could be happy in that kind of a job.
No, he's not going to be going to a lot of funerals.
In 1979, 5 months before George Bush had announced his candidacy, Michael Dukakis left the governor's office for the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. It was a bicycle ride from his Brookline home, a place where he would teach and have the time to think.
He really was doing an awful lot of soul searching. If I performed well, and I think the numbers show I performed well, he was saying to people that he talked to, and we're never close, what went wrong? Where did I go astray? Why did I offend somebody? Very, very open. Very open.
He has a quality about himself, a rather unusually dispassionate quality about himself. He can almost, take his parts out and put them on the table and, so we got a little more oil here and stuff.
I remember one time he said, a lot of people like you should have been more blunt with me. I said, no. Problem with you was you wouldn't listen.
He really was alienating an awful lot of people, and he wasn't leading them. He wasn't winning them over. It's not enough just to have a good idea, and you can be governor, you can be president, you got a good idea. If you can't convince enough people to go along with you, it won't work. Or maybe it works for a little while, but then they'll throw you out.
Where did this whole notion...
The program he created to teach state and local officials turned into a kind of training camp for his own re-election bid.
I think he began his teaching career as a talker. And all the sense I have from other people, and I guess his evaluations tend to support this, is that he became a much better listener as he realized that in order to talk, you have to hear first what other people are saying. And that seems to me as on a skill level, not on a value level, but on a skill level, was something that he probably did learn and took back with him to the public sector.
You got to have a process. Got to have a process here. You can't drop one of these things on people and tell them that's what's going to happen. Because they'll drop it on you, believe me. And nothing's going to happen. You got to have a process.
After 4 years of careful preparation, at the first opportunity to regain the governor's office, Dukakis announced his rematch against Ed King. The opening was provided by the mistakes Governor King's administration had made and by the spreading shadow of scandal. A blue ribbon commission investigating the state's contracting system gave the public daily evidence of what had been different about Governor Dukakis.
Local contracts. I have rigged bids.
It was a point made with unlikely clarity in the testimony of a fixer named Billy Mazziello.
Anybody's going to steal if they leave something on the table. They're going to steal it. You leave things out, they're going to grab it. When Dukakis came in, he ran a good administration. There were no open hands.
With Dukakis, Mazziello testified, my game was over. The people of Massachusetts deserve what they get. In 1982, Michael Dukakis was vindicated. After beating King for the Democratic nomination, he was elected governor once again. He had, he said, been given a second chance. 1981, George Bush assumed the role of Ronald Reagan's vice president.
He had participated in a good many of the cabinet council meetings, and at that level, when the president was not in attendance, was open and spoke about the matters. At cabinet meetings themselves, when the president was in attendance, he very seldom spoke, and in fact, even when he was asked, was reluctant to open up about these issues. Now, he had a weekly luncheon with the president on Thursdays, in which I presume was open and on both parts. But in front of others, or at least in front of the president, he was cautious, as were many people, in opening up and participating in what might seem like a controversy.
Bush took his own approach to a job that does not usually satisfy ambitious men.
And I think he had a very clear and conscious notion, which was pretty clever on his part, that if he had people who were really too aggressive, or if he had too many, too qualified people, I don't know what to put it, how else to say, particularly in the beginning, that all it would do would be create friction with the president.
Clearly, how he presents himself is kind of out of that lifestyle he grew up in, which is very soft and very polite and very low key, very gentle, and that's just kind of what's there. And I think it's probably very difficult for somebody out of that background and the family that George Bush had to be tough. That's just, they don't get points in that society for being tough.
And he never complained. He has never complained about the fact that he wasn't a major decision maker. He made contributions, but the job does not let you. And he turned out to be a happy vice president.
We do need more money for defense. There's no question about it. We do have to rearm America, but we can do it in a way that I think is consistent with these goals that you set forth in your campaign. And so what we're trying to do is identify some things that can be saved without injuring the rearming effort, and that's the goal to which we're dedicated.
Well, that's great. Anything further to add? Any comments? Or?
Legitimately, it does raise the question of how he would act in a leadership role, not because there's any evidence that he wouldn't act well, but because he has not been placed in that role, in the role of the #1 position in any of the places that he's been.
If he had decided that he couldn't live with that he had to be some big decision maker, in charge of outer space or something like that he would probably have turned the job down.
There were a few substantive assignments. He traveled to Beirut after the 1983 bomb attack on the Marine barracks.
I hadn't expected this much destruction. I mean, you'd heard it, you read it, but until you see it, and see the size of those reinforcing steel bars. And then I guess it's the horror, just the cowardly horror, of what happened, what somebody did.
Thank you, Vice President.
The visit led him to urge a quick end to that failed policy. performed the ceremonial duties of the vice presidency with graciousness, though his enthusiasm for the job at times bubbled over.
We love your adherence to democratic principle and to the democratic processes.
When political support for administration policy in El Salvador was threatened by outrage over thousands of death squad murders there, Bush once again took on an unenviable assignment. The administration knew those murders were carried out by military officers in the regime backed by Washington.
The president asked him to stop off in El Salvador. The vice president stops off and then says he'd like to meet with all of the top leaders of the El Salvadorian military. And they're all grim-faced as can be. Kind of a scary lot. And he starts in with a lecture, in effect, to tell them they're going to knock off this death squad activity. And they have to do a few other things. You know, Captain Joe Blow's got to be arrested. This guy has to be arrested. This one has to be gotten rid of. Get him out of the country. Not gotten rid of in an assassination way. Get him out of the country. And he played it beautifully. He'd get them very, very upset, and then he'd back off with a few nice comments like his great respect for military, and he'd go on a little bit about his military background and how, you know, countries rely on him.
If these death squad murders continue, you will lose.
The message was that if you guys don't get your act together, there's no way Uncle Sam is going to be coming down here with money to support you. Your whole country is going to go right down the drain. So get your act together, and here's the act you have to get together. And he would hit him with it. And he succeeded.
Beginning in the summer of 1985, George Bush attended at least 17 meetings where the sale of arms to Iran was discussed, including one crucial session when Secretary of State George Shultz and Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger vigorously opposed the plan. His own task force on terrorism had recommended against dealing with terrorists.
If the Vice President objects to this plan in Iran, Mr. President? The Vice President?
No. But Bush supported the President's decision.
Mr. President, are you satisfied with the advice you've been getting from the Vice President?
Always have to.
Mr. President, what do you know about money going to the Contras?
All I know is this is just going to taste wonderful, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
Vice President Bush, did you know about the Contra aid or not, sir?
But there's no question about trying to jump away from it.
And though top members of his own staff were in close contact with the Contras, Bush claims he was out of the operational loop on the decision to divert funds.
Disclosures made and all the revelations about the individuals involved known to me, I say, hey, this was wrong. So you learn by your mistakes.
He's been very loyal, been intensely loyal to the people that he served. And some of those people have not been worthy of it. It can certainly be suggested. Nixon, when he's not telling the truth, doesn't deserve that kind of loyalty. Reagan, when he's mistaken on policy, it can be said he doesn't deserve it. Iran, the Contra affair, or what have you. He equates the president with in the presidency with the United States, and he's loyal to his country. I do think there are times when he ought to shriek, that's all. Because if he doesn't, well, the appearance is that he likes what he's doing more than he should, and he doesn't want to jeopardize it.
When the vice president has to go out to try to help himself politically by saying what he's told the president.
In the jobs and the positions that George Bush has held, with the exception of the time that he's been in Congress, he has viewed himself as being in a position where his task was not to exercise independent leadership, but to carry through on a program that was given to him by his political superiors, and he's done that very, very well. In that respect, he's performed well in those jobs. So the question is that an admirable trait, or is that a trait for which one ought to be criticized? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. Perhaps it depends on where you're coming from.
1982. Michael Dukakis did not treat his victory this time as an evident triumph of virtue. He took it instead as a chance to persuade.
And to the members of the legislature, I have a very special message as we begin. My administration will listen.
Michael Dukakis now understands that in order to govern and in order to accomplish what you need to accomplish, you have to involve a lot of people. You have to build coalitions. You have to compromise. You have to decide what's important, what you're going to, and what you're going to not compromise on, and what you will compromise on. And in short, that the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line, which it never is in government. In retrospect, he learned that life is not that simple, and good deeds do not a re-election make.
Let me try to keep my remarks at you reasonably brief, because I suspect you've got lots of questions and maybe a speech or two of your own, and I'd rather open up the limited time that we have together to your thoughts and do some listening and exchanging of ideas.
Dukakis had disdained the role of politics in making policy. But in John Sasso, he found a political operative who encouraged a new flexibility.
John staffed him out wonderfully. John knows that it works. If you're an administrator, an elected official, and you're about to make a decision that affects a certain constituency, you either deal with them as you're making the decision and before you make the decision, or they'll kick the shit out of you afterwards. Because he is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a bleeding heart liberal. I'm a bleeding heart liberal. He's not even, a liberal. He's a moderate. He's a good, hardworking, honest, dependable, dull, moderate. He's got a great wife. It's sort of like, she's a wonderful woman. You say, God, what does she see in him? What if she sees something in him? There must be something there.
Early in the administration that would be known in Massachusetts as Duke II, a familiar problem provided a test for the new Dukakis.
When he opened up the books in February or March, it was like Yogi Berra would say, deja vu all over again, looking at potential $300 million of red ink. And he called Frank Keefe, his Secretary of Administration and Finance, and myself in and said, I'm not going to raise taxes. They're already too high. We're not going to cut spending. We've invested too little during these intervening years. We've got to find a third alternative, Ira. You've got 72 hours to tell me whether there's a way to raise adequate amounts of revenue by getting tax evaders and delinquents to pay their fair share.
Jackson's solution combined the Dukakis righteousness with an unorthodox idea. The state seized property, but it also offered amnesty to anyone who owed taxes. If they paid up voluntarily, they could do so without penalty.
What was going on at that revenue department had never been seen before. People who never paid taxes in their lives were paying it. So he had this double-digit increase in his tax base every year, cut taxes 4 times, 5 times, something like that, and still had this tremendous growth. So what you saw him more willing than ever to undertake new kinds of things.
Dukakis developed programs for urban renewal and job training. He led the state into partnerships with private industry and managed an economy that was on the upswing in the 80s. His record won him landslide re-election in 1986 and the title of Most Effective Governor in America, bestowed by his fellow chief executives.
Government is here to do something. To do something, not to stand passively by in the hopes that somehow the marketplace is going to work it out. Because it won't, and it doesn't.
He has a capacity to take a new problem, understand it, the essence of it, complicated problems. And he does that in a framework in which he really cares about making things better. As I've thought about it, it seems to me that's part of what's accounted for the strong loyalty that people who've worked with Michael Dukakis have toward him, even in some instances where they don't like him very much, and they've made that very clear. They still have respect for him, and they still work for him.
At times, Dukakis still had trouble reaching out, and this led some to question what higher vision he has for government than honest and efficient management.
I am very critical of Michael Dukakis because he very rarely initiates new programs to meet the unmet needs of the poor, the elderly, and the disabled. He doesn't do it on the environment either, and he doesn't do it on employment issues either. He just doesn't do it. And yet you do see signs that he, when presented with that information, moves in a very positive way. He told a story that he'd met a janitor and he was trying to help this guy get a job. In the course of the conversation, he said, the man told him he couldn't read. Well, actually, I'm illiterate. And Dukakis is standing up there in this crowd, again, ADA, upper middle class intellectuals, and he said, this is the first time I'd ever met a man over 40 that couldn't read. And they're all going, wow. Because they'd never been anybody that couldn't read either. I'm sitting beside my husband, who's a labor organizer among low-wage health workers. He's going, what kind of a jerk is this? Has never met an illiterate person. I mean, Peter works with him all the time. And I said, Peter, he's a doctor's son from Brookline. Leave him alone. But once he understood, they write a little program. Next thing you know, we have a wonderful little program here in Massachusetts to serve adult illiterates.
He doesn't seem to be all that sensitive to the early warning system. He seems to dismiss information which doesn't fit with the way either things are or he desperately wants them to be, so that the crises have to get a little bigger before they get to his attention. Once he sees the problem, he goes right after it. What I would worry about would be trying to get him to see things which were not yet clear, being able to look over the horizon. That's what I would worry about.
These are the men running for president. Both are optimistic, patriotic, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Each appeals to American escapism as well as to American pride. They are determined. Bush striving socially down, Dukakis striving moralistically up. Bush has been easy in his friendships, even with those of lax standards. Dukakis has indulged and urged to exclude even honorable people who were not considered excellent enough. Bush has moved up with the help of patrons. Dukakis likes to do things on his own. Where Bush has seemed too flighty, Dukakis looked too confined. One has been too yielding, the other too rigid. Neither is perfect. Yet each has a certain appeal that will be more important to his followers than any position paper. George Bush, the privileged embodiment of America's unearned graces, its abundance, its allure. Michael Dukakis, the individualistic embodiment of America's earned grace, its striving and performance. Each represents only partial versions of the American experience. But one or another will make just enough connection with just enough of the country to plunge us, ready or not, into the Bush years or the Dukakis years. The choice is ours.
The choice this year is not just between Michael Dukakis and George Bush. Presidential candidates Lenora Fulani of the New Alliance Party and Ron Paul of the Libertarian Party are also on the ballot in just about every state. You will meet them in a campaign special immediately following this program on most public television stations. Finally tonight, we want to take note of the death of Bud Benjamin. For many years, he was a producer and executive of CBS News. He was also a valued member of the Frontline Editorial Advisory Board. We will miss the gentleness and the wisdom and the integrity of Bud Benjamin. Thank you for joining us. I'm Judy Woodruff. Good night.
Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for Frontline is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding for this campaign special is provided by the Markle Foundation.